reports and the link to the Golden Thread. So we'll cover on some bits of that in a moment, but just so my background primarily in this role is mainly in the occupation phase. And then I'm joined today by Sue Butcher, who hopefully has got her mic on and can introduce herself to talk about what she does in the construction end of this.
Hello, Matt. Hello, everyone. Yes, you will have read my description in the LinkedIn event, but I just wanted to say that although I'm from a design background, I have worked across the sector. So I worked for manufacturers, helping them with their communication strategy. I worked with housing associations, particularly through BIMFIT HAs, on how to get their information requirements out of the supply chain, out of the process. And I've worked with institutions and trade associations across the sector in lots of different ways. And that's the advantage for me is that I'm blessed to have a bit of a broad perspective of what is going on in construction. And when I'm not writing for people, which is what I do in my day job, I really enjoy helping organisations understand what things are actually like compared to what they're said to be like, where things might be going, and help those organisations act accordingly. So I think that's why Matt's invited me to come and talk about this subject today.
Thank you, Sue. And you're not shy in sharing your experience and your frustrations with what's going on. So really, just in summary with the Golden Thread is as a subject, it's huge, it's complex, and there is lots of different, or a small amount of differing guidance out there. And I'm going to run through some of that guidance and where it all began. But I mean, sort of going back to where it all began. I mean, if we cast back to nearly 8 years ago now, the horrific tragedy at Grenfell. In the aftermath of that, Dame Judith Hackitt was appointed by the government to conduct a building a safer future report into fire safety. And one of the key findings that she found was the absence of good quality information, different versions of the truth, etc., etc. So that led to we'll come through the production of an interim report. And there were two in the interim report in December 2017, so getting on for 8 years ago. There were two mentions of the Golden Thread as a concept, and this is really where it first started. And that then rolled into the final report in May 2018, which is where there were then 26 mentions of the Golden Thread in that. But some of the pertinent ones I've pulled out here. One thing that is really important to bear in mind is at that time in 2018, when Dame Judith was talking about Golden Thread, the scope in that report for what constitutes a high-risk building, or a high-rise building as it was then, or a high-rise residential building as it was then, was 2,000 to 3,000 blocks. So at this time, the cutoff for Dame Judith was over 30 metres. So that gave you a universe of 2,000 to 3,000 blocks. Where we are now, with the government's subsequent redrawing of what an HRB is, where it kicks in, we're now at around about 13,000 blocks. And there is even talk now, after the Grenfell 2 recommendations, of addition, the scope being broadened even further. So we could go way beyond 30. So I think this is, in the context of the discussion today, and the complexity of managing and delivering against the Golden Thread goals, I think it's now fair to say this is way beyond perhaps what Dame Judith envisaged at the time of writing this report. So I think that's a really important point. And the other key point in this is the responsibility for holding information, which is where Dame Judith definitively says that it's the record keeping system is to be managed by the duty holders, which is fair enough. But I think as we go through this presentation, we'll realise that there's some unintended consequences of that and challenges. We then followed up in this timeline with a BRAC report. So BRAC have been disbanded now, but they put out a Golden Thread report in July 2021, which included 10 Golden Thread principles, which I'll come on to in a second. And there's been no real follow-up report to that. So that sort of line of advice dried up in July 2021. But they did come up with some good principles. So here are the 10 principles that that they said. Now, actually, when you read the subtext of all 10 principles, it's a fantastic sort of North Star to aim for, but actually the deliverability of this is something that really I don't think anybody's fully got their head around yet in terms of what this means, but that was their guidance. And again, this will all be coming out in the slides, so we can dwell on it for a bit longer, and maybe we can pick up on some of this in the Q&A. Rolling the clock forward to 2024, we get the keeping and provision of information regs. So there's a suite of regulations or statutory instruments that sit underneath the Building Safety Act. 3 of them mention the golden thread or the keeping of information in addition to this one. But the keeping and provision of information regs are, I would say, the main Bible for anybody that really wants to understand what they need to do to maintain a compliant golden thread. And that talks in Schedule 1 is where you need to look within this, which actually specifies information and documents that need to be retained on the golden thread. It sounds perfect, but actually when you read it and you try and understand the difference between information and documents, some documents are required, but there's no corresponding information, and vice versa. It's not an ideal piece of work, but they are the regulations you need to comply with. And then in February 2024, the government put out some golden thread guidance via the HSE. It really isn't worth the paper it's written on. It's 5 pages, it's including the front, and it lacks any real detail. So I'd say it's there, but it's not particularly useful. And then the way that we manage all of this, just so for anybody that's on the call that isn't signed up for this yet, we use our platform to try and organise all of this guidance and legal documentation in relation to the Building Safety Act. It's free to access if you just send me an email afterwards or contact me on social media. But effectively, you can log into this and then filter by golden thread or by any other topic, and it will bring back the documents that are specifically about that topic. So this is just an example of that. So feel free to join up for that, as lots of other people have already. And we do our best to try and keep this up to date as new guidance is issued. And I think this is something that, Sue, perhaps with your version control bugbear, do you want to jump in on in terms of
yeah, it's interesting this because I've become very frustrated about how the fact that you're doing this as effectively as an individual and keeping this information in a version control situation, and that isn't happening by the HSE is telling to me. And I was thinking when we were preparing for this session, I was thinking about the guidance, and I thought when you talked about the February guidance that you were talking about the August guidance, because do you know there is more golden thread guidance that you haven't seen because it isn't published by the HSE, it's published by the Construction Leadership Council. It's available via the HSE's building safety website. I shall put a link in the chat because, but this was published in August, and that was that there's a summary document and there's a detailed document, and slide 6 of the summary document shows that you can only do it with a digitized system because of what they're asking for. But what I've just realized is that you may not have this document, and the reason why you don't have it is you're relying on the HSE's notifications process, and they haven't provided this information. And yeah, we've talked before about the cost structure that the HSE puts out for its for the regulator puts out, and that there are 2 versions of it, and they're both called version 1, published over a year apart. It's very concerning to me.
Okay, we will if you can send me the link, if you can share it. Yes. I'll also update the resource centre as well once I find it. So thank you. I think that's a good illustration of how perhaps we're not all practicing what we preach. But it's early days, and again, you know, the regulator has been given a hospital pass really in terms of the amount of work that they've got to do.
Yeah.
So this slide, take it all in, but there is a requirement for the golden thread to be built through the gateway process of, gateway 1 being around design, gateway 2 being construction, gateway 3 being handover. I've left gateway 4 off this, and it isn't an exhaustive list, but I think this is probably a good time to pause and talk, Sue, about the first part of the process, which is design and construction, and then we'll drop back into occupation. So I'll advance your slides that you've given to me, and you tell me if you do the next slide, please.
Okay.
I think probably like COVID. So hang on one sec.
No problem at all. Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 things really. What is a golden thread from my perspective, what that means for construction, and then the sort of key question really, is that actually going to happen and will it work? So I'm really talking about the design and construction process rather than the handover process, but of course it's all connected. So let's go on to the first question. You can move the slides on. So from the golden thread principles written in 2021, the golden thread is both the information that allows you to understand a building and the steps needed to keep both the building and people safe now and in the future. That was the sort of underlying principle that those 10 principles came from. And I was invited to write a piece for Risk Authority, who are a research scheme funded by UK insurers, administered by the Fire Protection Association. And they wanted to understand why the construction industry might not be able to provide the information that they required about the buildings they insured, and particularly because they're interested in whether they could get access to the information provided under Regulation 38 of the building regs, the fire safety information, the regulation that's been around since I think the 1980s, that in a way we ought to be talking about. And the conclusion of my research was that people looking after buildings, including insurers, need the right information to keep buildings safe. That means they need to know what's in those buildings, so that the right products and systems with the right information about them attached to that have been properly installed, correctly installed by competent people. And that information then has to travel a secure, reliable journey through the life of the building. And this is what I think the golden thread is and should be. And only that way do you get an effective audit trail. Now you can decide what products and systems, and you can decide, what information. But if you want to demonstrate safety, that's the sort of process that we're talking about. And I can share, obviously I'll share some links to these, the paper that I wrote, which is available for free online as well. So what does that mean for the construction industry? You can go on now. So that I think this means a massive change for the construction supply chain. And to understand why I say that, you need to understand how construction works in terms of the people involved, in terms of the processes, and in terms of technology. Because all sorts of people are involved in this process. And if you look at each of those things, you can see how I broke it down in terms of who's responsible, who might be responsible for what. So firstly, let's think about people. Our industry is huge and complex. We're talking about 2 million people. And the percentage of companies who, involved in that who are SMEs is very large. So in construction generally, and these figures come from the Morel Day Review of Construction Product Testing, where he actually had to go and try and get hold of this information because the government doesn't publish it. 99% of construction companies, generally in construction, are fewer than 50 employees. And that means about 60% of employees in construction work in small businesses. 92% of construction product companies are fewer than 50 employees. So just less than half of employees of construction product companies work in small businesses. And this also tallies with my own research looking at architecture firms based on the RIBA data. I'd estimate around 85% of architecture practices have fewer than 10 employees. So we're talking about lots and lots of companies who are quite small. And that obviously creates a particular problem for understanding what you're supposed to do and having the commercial ability to keep up with the requirements of legislation. You just don't have a team who can get you data savvy, for example. Secondly, process. The processes of constructing buildings is largely still adversarial. So over 50% of projects, at least procured in construction, are design and build, which is a process whereby the initial project is designed and then it is handed over to a contractor who agrees to then do the detailed design themselves. That's a very general description of design and build. I don't need to get into a lot of detail. But also, the other thing about the process is there are an awful lot of market pressures, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, particularly for these SMEs. And then thirdly, technology, digitization and information management. For example, do not assume that the published figures of BIM adoption are actually credible, because of the way that they were gradually gathered over a long period of time by the MBS, and the MBS is the figures about BIM adoption that are largely published. They were adopted in a way that means that they're doubtful. So we've got lots of SMEs working in an adversarial system and not very data aware and not necessarily using BIM or not using it in the way in which it is currently recommended under ISO 19650. So that's the context. Okay, so how is this going to happen? Is it going to happen? Could we actually do this and collect this information and pass it on to you? Let's move on to the next slide. Well, I think there are three things that have to happen, and they're all about the modernisation of the construction industry. And in some ways, I'm optimistic, because I think there are elements of the Building Safety Act that are pushing this to happen, and there are signs that it is happening. But it is an enormous job, and I do have some sympathy with the regulator and the people working with the regulator trying to make this happen, because it isn't easy given the scale of the thing. So let's talk about the three areas I think we should think about. Procurement is first. So I've already talked about design and build. The diagram that I've shown here is known as the McLeamy curve, but it was actually originally drawn in 1976. So we've been talking about moving design decisions earlier in the process and getting earlier involvement of everyone in the design process for decades. There's even an organisation called Constructing Excellence who've been talking about the value of early design decisions and how important that is, making the right decisions early, and how much value there is in the operations of a building for about as long as that. So we keep talking about it. And collaborative working and early involvement is happening with the large contractors. So what they're doing is pulling their supply chain up into a common data environment and getting them to share the information they require, bringing SMEs in earlier and forming partnerships with distributors and with architects over a longer term and standardizing their processes. But at the same time, we have to think about the fact that the vast majority of the industry is so small. So for example, subcontractor insolvencies. Specialist subcontractors often work on a fixed price contract, and they're very reliant on cash flow. And if you follow Noble Francis, who's the Construction Product Association's economist, he reported last year that that 4,208 construction firms became insolvent in the year to October 2024, of which 58%. So nearly 2,500 were specialist subcontractors. So they're really taking the hit. And that sort of number is consistently for 3 years been at that level, above pre-pandemic level consistently. So I can share a link to that data as well if you like to see it. And the other thing is, well, what about BIM? BIM is promoted as a collaborative process, encouraging earlier decision making. But anecdotally, and I've seen recently discussed online, clients are using the fact that they can make design decisions later to make more design changes later in the process. So that advantage of early involvement and different procurement techniques is now being undermined by the process of just continually changing the design later on in the process, and eating into everybody's margins and making things more expensive. It's also worth mentioning that the sort of idealistic idea of BIM as a single federated information model may not actually be happening. And there's a chap called Professor Phil Bernstein, who 5 years ago pointed out that rather than one federated model, what was happening is different actors in the supply chain were making lots of little BIMs rather than a more integrated approach. And that means multiple data entry, lots of changes to the design, lots of complexity, even more complexity. So that's just the procurement stuff. Moving on quickly to information management, when we started, and when I say we, I mean the Plain Language Group, which is an independent advocacy group trying to get the industry to digitise, started writing about post-Grenfell, almost immediately after Grenfell. We identified that the missing thing that no one was talking about, that Hackitt wasn't talking about, and the initiatives in construction weren't talking about, was information. It was all about compliance, integrity and competence, but nothing about information management. And we know that digitization of manufacturers isn't a priority, and our own research supports that. And there's a problem with digital skills generally in industry, but definitely in construction. And I think industry is still heavily paper-based, but when it's not paper-based, it's still working heavily with PDFs, and they're not managed in a structured manner, and they're not working with structured machine-readable data. And more importantly, the third thing really is that our research has identified there's a lack of awareness of what we're actually talking about, even at a basic fundamental level, what information management is, what a single source of truth is, what version control is at C-suite level, in construction generally. And I think that passes on further into the leadership of the construction sector as well. And if the leaders who are standing up on platforms and giving talks about the Golden Thread don't understand what information management is at a fundamental level, I think we've got a big problem getting the construction industry to take it seriously and know how to adopt it at all. So that's really what I wanted to say. I haven't talked about HSE enforcement or anything, but yeah, that's the problem space.
It's a really, really big subject. And I think one of the things that I think we talked about before, but you didn't mention them, was around the impact now of the Building Safety Act and the regimes with the gateways in terms of design decisions, and the delays not only of the initial Gateway 2 application, but then change control and subsequent changes after Gateway 2, and what that will mean in terms of demonstrating as built at Gateway 3 to allow occupation. You know, so you really do need to get on top of knowing what you built and how you built it.
There is definitely a reluctance, and that's, I think, because of the Gateway 2 process, excuse me, and how long it takes, because you have to, if you want to change after Gateway 2, you then have to go through, you have to submit, and then there's a minimum 6-week wait process, I think it is, before you get a decision, and you have to stop working whilst that's happening. Then there's a reluctance in the contracting process to actually do that. So what's happening is the larger contractors that I know about are actually involving people much earlier on in the process and trying to get everything signed off much earlier. And that's so unlike the traditional method of construction. That's in a way, it's a positive thing, because it will push things to become more efficient, but also it requires so much more work up front, and it's a significant change to the way a lot of companies are working. So it's a positive thing, but if you then want to later change the design, you're in a big hole, particularly with the problems that are being had with getting decisions out of the regulator.
And what I'm seeing from what you're saying is that even within the construction industry, and that this is in terms of volume, this is the smaller end of the regulated market. So this is just the new build, really the new buildings coming through out of the ground, not the 13,000 that we've already got. So we'll talk about those in a minute.
Oh yes.
But these ones, this seems to be a really significant job of work and a task to understand how to do this in new build. That if we can't organise that, how do we organise the distribution of the 13,000 at the other end that are currently occupied? And I think we will talk about that, but it's just really interesting to observe. You would thought that this would, in theory, be the easiest part of the process, but from what you've shown us, I think when you get into manufacturing as well.
Yeah, it is difficult enough, and you're right. When it comes to existing buildings, there's a even greater problem, because of course the record keeping for those buildings isn't there. So if you talk to anyone who's actually working on site, or actually does on-site surveys, they are very used to knowing that the as-built drawings aren't accurate, and that's not surprising. Simply because they will have been kept in paper form, and doing as-built drawings at the end of a project is a thankless task, and the client has to pay for it. And then every time in the past, before the building safety regulator, before all this new regime, changing those drawings is not a priority, because you weren't required to keep a record of change. So therefore the building has changed and the as-built drawings have not, and they're no longer connected to each other. So so you have to really start again, and who's going to pay for that? That's
so I think problem. That the we've talked about before, and I think what's happened is that you've got the sort of and I generally I think this is the way that we need to go. This is what the industry needs.
Yes.
But I think it's been brought about through what I would call oil rig thinking or chemical plant thinking, which is highly engineered environments with huge specialists delivering them and designing them, delivering them, with high hazard industries, and then very closely supervised and managed going forward by a single employer potentially. Whereas residential property is entirely not that.
No.
In terms of the user behaviour, the people that manage them, the volume of them, the money that's available to manage them, and probably the much lower level of hazard than the environments that we're mirroring the thinking from.
Yeah, so, and it's a very different animal to the one that Dame Judith Hackitt works in her career, and that's an interesting problem. It makes it much more difficult to handle, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you were to ask somebody, should you have records of a building that's 10 years old or whatever that completely mirrors exactly what's being built, and you would say, well, of course you should. But the reality of flowing that through, the practical reality. And I think that's why when I was looking at the heading for today, I was sort of thinking, well, is it fact? Is it happening? Is it fiction? As in it's stupid, or is it a bit of a fantasy, or where are we? Three-letter alliteration.
And actually, it is happening, isn't it? But it's very painful, I think, and it's causing difficulty, and people are having to change their mindset. And there's a lack of understanding of how to actually make this work at scale with your organisations, and of course, when you get a skills gap like that, then there's lots of opportunity for people to jump into that place and offer a solution, and those solutions might or might not necessarily be ideal given the reality of the situation that the companies are in. So it's a very challenging time for the industry.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Sue. Right, we'll move on now. So we've built the building. We've got beautiful information. Let's look at the challenges of occupation. So I've used this slide before, and for people that came to the last one, then sorry for running it around, but I just wanted to again get forward. When we're in occupation, the regulatory regime now requires 3 key pieces of documentation to be submitted to the regulator for assessment. So that's the safety case report, a resident engagement strategy, and a mandatory occurrence reporting system. And they specify that you provide that to them as documents. So you upload 3 documents. Sitting beneath those will be well over 100 pieces of documentary evidence that will support the claims that you make in your safety case report. So that might be a copy of a installation certificate or a maintenance visit from an electrical engineer or a fire risk assessment or whatever it is. And again, I'm just shamelessly just talking about documents at the moment because that's hard enough in its own right to summon. So when you're making in your safety case report, you say, you know, every 3rd Wednesday we do X, there should be corresponding evidence that X is being done. So how do you evidence that? Is it a photograph? Is it a photo survey? Is it a certificate? What is it? And are those items within their date boundaries, you know, or have you just forgotten to do something or failed to do something? Talking to somebody yesterday that inherited a building or part of their company rescinded a management contract with a management managing agent was responsible for commissioning a fire risk assessment. It came back to the housing association, but nobody had told them that it had come back. They caught it, but again, similarly, if they hadn't have caught it, we could have sailed through the next year, 2-3 years with nobody bothering to do a fire risk assessment. Now that should show, and whether you've done it or not done it, that evidence should be on the golden thread for the building. So either it's there or it's not there. That's not to say that it's saying that this is fit for purpose. It's saying, does that item exist on the golden thread? And if it doesn't, why not? And again, the regulator could, we haven't seen the evidence of them doing it yet, but the regulator could come and say, I want to come and inspect your golden thread for building X, in which case they would have the right to do that, as I understand it from the legislation. They'll certainly probably do it if you fall foul of them in terms of some kind of regulatory enforcement. And again, I think the test case for this would be the Spectrum building in Dagenham that burnt to the ground last August. If the investigation goes in that way, I think they would be within their rights to say, I want to inspect the golden thread for that building, and it would either have sufficient content within it or it wouldn't. And I'll come on in a minute to what needs to be on the golden thread. You've also got to look at portfolio management as well. So it's all very well, the legislation all talks about buildings in isolation, but the practical reality of when you're managing, most people that have a higher risk residential building don't just manage one, they have multiples. So although the legislation is all about the building as in isolation as a silo, you will actually have the requirement to manage a portfolio. So making it difficult is then multiplied by however many buildings that you've got. And then where did those buildings come from? How old are they? What records do you have prior to taking it over? Is it new? Is it old? What's the construction method, etc.? But ultimately that will lead to an accumulation of documentary evidence and information that should be connected to your safety case report and in support of your safety case report. So then you have a layer across the top, which is, how do I know what's going on in my buildings? You know, are they compliant, if you like? Are they golden threads deficient? Are their golden threads developing at the right rate? So again, what happens in reality, especially with occupied buildings, is you start off with a relatively small set of information. That information grows. Somebody goes into the basement, finds the AO plans from 25 years ago, finds a company to scan them, and then organizes them and gets them into the golden thread. Or you go into the basement and find that it flooded 10 years ago and somebody threw all of those soggy drawings out, and then you're in another world of pain of trying to recreate that information to populate your golden thread. So that's how you do it. I mentioned earlier the regulations, the key regulations of the keeping and provision of information regulations. And in Schedule 1, it talks about the principal accountable or the accountable person, and it talks about then a list of prescribed information and prescribed documents. And there's a bit of overlap. So this is the prescribed information. Each one of these headings has a paragraph or two supplementary information. They're all on the resource centre for you to read through. It's Schedule 1 that you're looking for. And really, it's a sort of a capture everything kind of wish list, I think, is the way of looking at it. So that's the information. And then the documents, again, a copy of your building assessment certificate. So sorry, it's a BA certificate, but a BAC certificate, or your BAC. A copy of your application. If you get a refusal of your BAC, you need to keep a copy of that. But then you're into things like a generic term like plans. So there they specify as built and original construction. So it is actually clearly laid out in regulation. Quite how close anybody's got to actually having the full suite, I'm not sure. But I think it's a good list to work towards and say, well, do we have sufficient information held about building safety risk assessment, for example, or the structural risks of the building? It may well also be that you tick a number of those boxes within a particular artifact. So it may well be that within your hazard workshop, for example, you've got sufficient information about structural risks, so you would point that to your hazard write-up. Copies of complaints, etc., etc. So the list goes on. It is a very long list. And again, it's a question of how close you want to be to fully compliant. One interesting point with this, fire safety regulations information, actually the KPI regs reference the Fire Safety England regs, but they don't actually call it Fire Safety England, they just talk about fire safety regulations. But within the detail, it does talk about things like external wall information. So again, that's specific information that needs to be submitted to the fire service locally under the Fire Safety England regs. So there is a crossover between the regs. But effectively, that's where you're looking. It is a big long list. Within that, just another thing to mention is if you think about document history and document control, where you want to be with your golden thread, regardless of how you do it, is to be able to say, and it does say it in the legislation in a different way, is where did that piece of information come from? When did it change? And then the bit that I've added onto it is who's accessed it, because it needs to be accessible. But can you tell me who's accessed it? When did they access it? Which version did they look at? So if they made a decision 5 years ago, what information were they armed with at the time of making the decision, not the information that prevails now? So that's really important, and it's sort of threaded into the regulations, but not explicitly identified. And again, back into this history, each file or document, however you want to look at a piece of information, will have a lot of history associated with it over time. That I would recommend needs to be tracked. And when we were talking with somebody the other day about this, we said, well, it's exactly the same, for example, about a fire door in a building, that it's properly installed and shiny on day one as built, and you can certify that. And then it meets residents, and it meets maintenance people, and it meets the police knocking it in, etc., etc. Over time, that fire door may well become reversioned. Have you got that in your data in terms of understanding where we are now? How many times has this been changed or fundamentally changed? Has that been recorded? So again, just thinking about golden thread is about understanding all of this stuff that goes on within a building to be able to either prove or disprove a theory. So that's us for the moment, hopefully just about on time for questions. I'm going to take a pause, and if somebody that's got access to seeing who's got their hand up or has submitted a question could sort of chair the questions, and then Sue and I will do our best to answer them. And Richard, if you could jump into that.
Yeah, Matt, I don't know if you're able to see the chat messages, but
I can't.
I can see them.
Sue's been responding to some of them, actually.
I have,
Do you want to lead this one then, Sue? Why don't you do it?
Okay, so Liam Trott asks, is there any data available to see the changes in proposed building heights as a result of these changes? I can imagine there's a significant reluctance to build properties over the height thresholds to avoid the gateways. And I've replied to him that I wasn't aware of any study like that, but it would be interesting, and it may be possible that that someone is doing that sort of research? I don't know if you.
I've heard anecdotally. So talking to a large managing agent or medium-sized managing agent a few days ago, that they said that they're hearing from people, that just people saying from a management perspective, is it worth being in the high-rise business?
Yeah.
I've also heard about some agents being disinstructed because they've made a hash of the application process, the building of the golden thread and the edge case report process. So they've either jumped out of the market or they've been fired because they're not deemed to be competent to do that, or they've had a problem with the regulator. So at the moment, I think it's anecdotal, but definitely I would ask myself the question, if I could build below that height threshold and it worked financially, why would I make my life more difficult by building a high rise if I didn't have to? So I would imagine there's probably been an element of that.
Yeah, I think it's the tension between the commercial and the rules. I also mentioned in the chat, of course, there's the smokehouse ruling, which has confused the idea about whether a roof garden is a story or not. Then once you get into those sort of questions, it does get a bit more threatening to your profit line.
It would be interesting as well that I came across a building the other day, and it'd be great for anybody in the chat if anyone can beat this. As the smallest HRB that I've come across professionally so far, a couple of days ago, it's in London. It's 18.1 meters and 5 stories, and it contains 8 flats. So that's by the definition of the legislation, that's an HRB.
Yes.
So I think there are a lot of edge cases like that as well, where if only 150 years ago they'd have built that building slightly shorter, they'd have avoided this problem. But it'd be interesting from anyone else that's listening if anyone else has got a crazier example than that.
We've also got Edward, who's put, on the subject of record keeping, I'm a managing agent and I have yet to find a building where any of the O&M manuals from construction or refurbishment have been retained. Standards are shockingly low. And I commented that I'm not surprised because, there's an awful lot of information about a building when you think about all the products in it that need to be retained, just in terms of management, all the M&E and so on, and all the appliances. There are a lot of initiatives that are trying to get this changed. Building passports stuff and that being related to tenants as well, and that there's a lot of opportunity to do something about this, because just having your archive boxes in the basement isn't a secure way of doing it, but it needs the industry to actually provide structured data and properly managed information, and that's where the challenge is.
I think on that point, there's sort of one of the reasons why I pointed out the 2,000 to 3,000 buildings when Dame Judith came up with this idea, as opposed to the 13,000. I would hazard a guess, when she was writing that report and the team were writing that report, they didn't think of an 8-flat, 5-story building in London being in the scope of this legislation. Number one, so that's one problem. And I think, because there's so much technical information that may or may not have come with the building, and managing agents manage buildings, but they're not deep they're not structural engineers, for example. They're probably, even if you did objectively look at it for a building that's 15 years old and you went through and said, do we really need all these 15-year-old structural engineers drawings, structural designs? No, not really. So it may well have been told in that way or just lost. And now when the BSR is saying, please demonstrate, how this building is not going to fall down because it's built over a London Underground station or whatever, you need those drawings, but they're no longer there. So then how do you recreate them?
Yes. And actually, when you think about it, I think this is a really important message, that the information about a physical thing is as valuable, if not more valuable, than the physical thing itself. Because if you don't have the information about it, then it is no longer has the same value. So, for example, if you think about the circular economy, and this is why the whole idea of digital product passports has become adopted by the European Commission, and it's publishing regulations about them. Doesn't really know how they're going to work yet, but it's got this idea that if you have information about products and that is retained in a digital format and connected to the product itself, then you can know what the performance characteristics of that concrete beam are, or whatever, and therefore it can be reused rather than recycled. And of course, the whole point of the circular economy is it's not about recycling, it's about reusing, not using at all by removing by design, refusing to use, repurposing, repairing, and so on, before you get to the whole recycling thing. So there are loads of commercial reasons why the data has commercial value, and we have to start thinking about that information as a commercial thing. So the other question, of course, that comes from that is, who owns that data? Who owns the information? And we've always said, from the manufacturer's point of view, the manufacturer should be responsible for the data about its products, because it knows more about its products than anyone else. In theory, you could say that about the engineer designing the concrete beam, that they are the single source of truth for the information about that concrete beam, and they should be keeping their records. But of course, there's an obligation on people to do this, and there's a cost to that. But the idea about all the information about a building being held together with the building is a really valuable thing. And, Grenfell has taught us that, and how little we know about our buildings.
Any more questions?
We have a couple more in the chat, but I was going to also suggest that if anybody wants to just stick a hand up, you can hit the hand icon at the bottom. And we can field verbal questions as well. Jordan Bartlett, if you'd like to unmute yourself, Jordan.
G'day, Sue. Call from Australia. I take a risk-based approach to construction. I don't follow the building code. I look at the natural physics of a building before I actually, and then do a design, and then I refer back to the building code to check that I'm actually meeting it. I believe you're from a risk background as well. How many people look for the cherry pick from the building code to look for solutions or the minimums they have to do without actually thinking about the actual natural environment versus the natural law versus the law of man? And is that the sort of approach you would take towards consideration?
I'm actually not from a risk environment. I'm from a design background. I trained as an architect originally, so yes, I'm not. But it's been interesting working in that space. So I'm not sure if I can answer your question.
No, that's fine. I might have assumed too much.
No, but it's it's an interesting thing. You're in Australia, is that right?
I am. It's 8 minutes to 10 right now, 10 p.m.
Oh, well,
yes.
Thanks very much for joining us. Yeah,
that's right.
I think there is a challenge with, as in the UK we have the building regulations. With the regulations, and I don't know whether this is the same in Australia, that the regulations are the rules. But since the 1980s, some correct me if I'm wrong, the regulations have become quite vague. And then they're accompanied by what we call the approved documents, which are guidance. They're not regulations, so they're not rules that you must abide to. They're an example of how the regulations are applied, could be applied to a building design. The problem with that, so the regulation says adequately prevent the spread of fire or something. They don't define what adequately is. The problem with that is then the guidance has been developed, and there are people working in the industry who have discovered, particularly since Grenfell, that there are ambiguities in the guidance, because the guidance is prepared by committees of people who work for manufacturers and designers. And there are lots of lobbying going on to change the guidance to make it more likely to favour certain construction methods. So there's a chap called Ian Abley who posts a lot on LinkedIn about this, and he's very concerned about the whole the testing regime for products, and in particular how Aparto and the large scale testing and all of that, and how that has affected our guidance. And when people say the building regs need rewriting in the UK, they're actually talking about the guidance needs rewriting, because it is actually ambiguous. At least I believe that to be the case. So then, yeah, you have to. The corollary to that, the end of that is, yes, in the UK, you actually have to take the regulations and then make your own judgment about whether what you're doing complies with them or not. And actually, everyone has to do that, but most people just follow the guidance.
Yeah, we had a lot of confidence here that we were that all these countries with flammable cladding and all these fires were. I guess we were seeing ourselves a bit being a bit more. We were smarter than them. They just don't know how to build. And Grenfell Tower for Australia with the wake up call. Sorry. That was a wake up call that maybe we actually have to look at ourselves. And
yes.
But we've been fostering innovation for so many years and it takes 5 to 10 years for innovation to actually show up as a defect or a risk to people. So we have all this vulnerability now in our buildings that it could be there's so many other things that I investigate in my work, and people just look at me and go, mate, building code doesn't require it. I'm like, no, it requires due diligence. And that's what I feel like it's missing. We can't hide behind the paperwork anymore.
Yeah, and I think that the whole experience of what's been happening, certainly in the UK with leaseholders and not being able to get mortgages and so on, is partly from the awareness of the uncertainty of things that's come about over the last.
On that point, Sue, the regulatory regime that we now have for high risk buildings is a risk-based rather than a rules-based regime.
Yes.
So it has shifted away from, this was a compliant building, whatever that means, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe.
No.
So we're moving to safer buildings, but then we do bring a huge amount of ambiguity in. Yes. And then you start getting into these problems around things like PAS 9980, which is, the risk-based approach to combustible external walls, combustibles and external walls, whereas you do have a strict rule on a new building of the same height now that you can't use those combustibles. So we're justifying keeping them on based on risk management, whereas the code says you can't use these materials. So there are ambiguities, and ultimately we have got this huge amount of legacy stock. Yes. That we've got to work out how do we deal with it and how do we keep it safe. The thing I would always just remind everybody is that Grenfell thankfully was an exceptionally rare occurrence. We never should rest, but we also need to keep it in proportion as to how intrinsically dangerous are high-rise residential buildings.
Yes.
And I would say probably not as dangerous as perhaps you might be led to believe by all that's gone on in the last 8 years. So I think we just got to be very careful about proportionality.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But I'm not an insurer or a lender, so they have different views. Yes. Okay, any more questions?
We do have a couple more in the chat. We're running quite short on time, so we'll have to be quick. James, I don't know if you wanted to quickly jump in with your comments about ISO standards, your question about ISO standards.
Yeah, I mean, we've got quite well established ISO standards around BIM in relation to everything like that. I mean, do we foresee, BSI working on kind of updating BIM standards to incorporate more golden thread type of requirements, or kind of standalone ISO standards that are going to kind of work towards practical frameworks for the implementation and the kind of standardization of what clients expect, or principal accountable persons expect in terms of the information they receive and what contractors or designers need to provide, and so on and so forth?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not aware of what BSI are doing in relation to the Golden Thread. I know that when 650 came out, there was an interest in trying to get it adopted in housing generally, and that's partly why BIM for Housing Associations was set up by a group of housing associations, some of the G15 and some others, to look at how it might be applied to housing, and then following on from that, incorporating the Golden Thread guidance, and such as it was when we produced the toolkit, it did incorporate that. But I'm happy to go and have a look and have a chat with some people and find out what they're doing. Unless somebody is aware already, they can put in a comment.
I'm conscious of time. I'm going to have to draw stumps now.
Yes.
If there's anyone else has any more questions or observations, please get in contact with us. We can pick up afterwards. I've already had a load of people texting me during the thing saying could they come to the resource centre. Just to plug the next Lunch and Learn, title to be determined. We'll probably try and put out a poll and see what people want to talk about. But let's put it in the diary, 5th of June, 12 till 1. I think it clashes with Digital Construction Week, but you know, I'm sure you can do both. So there will be a link coming out for that. And then if you want to follow up either with Sue or myself, please contact us by any way. And also, if you've got the copy of the slides, the QR code's linked to our calendar booking system, so you can book a meeting in and we can have a chat. So I think without any further ado, it just leaves it for me to say thank you. Thank you to Sue for giving up her time for coming along. And thank you to everybody that joined, and for all of those that will watch afterwards on YouTube and various other channels. And look forward to seeing you this time next month. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Matt.